you both to ensure that you keep your voices up. It's going to be a little difficult at times, Professor Alexander, to hear you, so it's important that you do keep your voice up. If you're asked anything about which you're not clear, please ask for the question to be put again. There will be a break at lunchtime our time, and there will be a break during the course of the afternoon as we proceed through your evidence. Thank you very much indeed for your joint expert report, weighing in, I'm proud to say, at a hefty 321 pages. Could we have that, please, on the screen? It is 203349. And, my lady, may we have your permission to have that report published?
We have.
At page 2 of the report, we see something in short order of your professional qualifications. Professor Alexander, commencing with you, please. First, are you Professor of Risk and Disaster Reduction at University College London? From 1982 until 2002, did you teach in the fields of geomorphology, physical geography, natural hazard and disaster studies at the University of Massachusetts in the United States of America? Were you also Scientific Director of the Advanced School of Civil Protection of the Regional Government of Lombardy, and also Professor at the University of Florence?
It is correct.
You have published the book Natural Disasters. It was published in London and New York in 1983. It's been subsequently reprinted, and you've published a number of subsequent books and articles, including How to Write an Emergency Plan.
That's correct.
And were you, or are you, still Vice President and Chairman of the Trustees of the Institute of Civil Protection and Emergency Management?
I am.
Mr. Mann, turning to you, from 1979 to 2016, were you a member of the United Kingdom Civil Service, serving in the Ministry of Defence and the Cabinet Office?
That is correct.
Your MOD roles included being head of the Nuclear Accident Response Organisation, Director of Defence Policy, and MOD roles in the Falklands, Gulf and Kosovo conflicts. Most relevantly, for our purposes, did your Cabinet Office experience include serving in the Cabinet Secretariat dealing with terrorism and Cold War planning, then subsequently being Director of the Civil Contingencies Secretariat from 2004 to 2009?
That is correct.
And were you also the leader of the independent review of the Civil Contingencies Act and its supporting arrangements 2022?
I was.
Itself also a weighty tome. Do you, and have you both confirmed that the report which you've very kindly provided for us is the product of your own work, that the facts stated in it are within your own knowledge, and you understand your duty to provide independent evidence and expertise?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Now, it's probably convenient to start by considering very briefly the scope of your report. Could we please have up page 201? There we are, Annex A, scope of the report. You've set out there the matters that you were asked to address by this inquiry, and in very broad terms, were you asked to consider the overall approach to risk and emergency management and a number of issues relating to that broad topic, pandemic preparedness, in particular whether there were in place suitable arrangements for identifying and assessing the risk of a non-influenza pandemic, such as a coronavirus pandemic, whether or not there was an effective approach to building whole system preparedness, the extent to which lessons had been learned from other countries, about which we've just heard Professor Heyman give evidence, and whether, again in particular, overall pandemic preparedness and resilience arrangements properly highlighted in the United Kingdom and prepared for the cascading consequences of a pandemic. So, in truth, a very wide scope indeed. Could you please have up on the screen page 9? You commence your report by setting out, as we've just seen, the matters which you were asked to address, and at page 9, the sections into which you've divided your response. And the way that you've done it is that you set out in section 2 the strategic approach adopted by successive UK governments. You addressed in section 3 the key preparedness structures. Sections 4, 5, 6 over the page were the key preparedness structures and the supporting arrangements adequate? And then, most importantly, perhaps for the purposes of today, latterly in your report, you addressed the broad area of pandemic preparedness before bringing all that together and providing a very long list of conclusions and recommendations. Is that right, Mr. Mann?
It is.
In the first part of your report, we don't need, I think, to get it up on the screen. You make this point. More reports on generic or pandemic preparedness are published every week. There are hundreds of recommendations made, but we are conscious the inquiry set itself the goal of reporting quickly. And one of the reasons why that is a desirable aim, Mr. Mann, is that lessons may be learned as soon as practicable. What is the position of the United Kingdom government? What is its judgment in relation to potential future frequency of infectious disease outbreaks?
I think there are two key points from documents published by the government. I wouldn't say that they address the question of frequency. I think the two key points are as follows, and I'll quote from those documents. First, that infectious disease outbreaks are likely to be more frequent by 2030. And second, that another novel pandemic remains a realistic possibility. That is in the so-called integrated review of defence, security and resilience that was published in 2021.
So at a very broad and provisional and necessary introductory approach, is it generally well recognised then that there is now an even greater need to inquire into these issues, to report and to learn lessons in the field of disease outbreaks?
I hope that it is recognised. I recognise the statements here, but clearly they need to be followed through into action.
If I might add here, I'm slightly surprised that the government said that another novel pandemic remains a realistic possibility. I would have thought a better way of describing it is as an inevitability, given that if we look at history, pandemics have been recurrent throughout recorded human history.
A great deal, a large part of your report, Professor Alexander and Mr. Mann, sets out very detailed, quite prescriptive views on aspects of the United Kingdom system for preparedness, resilience and response. And at the beginning of your report, therefore, you've set out some of the features of the way in which you've gone about trying to identify the most important points. And you've set out some generic points about the way in which you've approached your exercise and how Milady and this inquiry should go about considering the general field of preparedness in the context of our emergency, civil emergency procedures. So may I turn to just trying to highlight some of the general points that you've made in your report. The first point you make, and it's at page 12, paragraphs 12 and 13 of your report, is that you say that it's very important to note and to acknowledge that on account of the planning, undoubtedly necessary and worthwhile planning that was done for the potential no-deal exit from the European Union, the inevitable consequence of the devotion of time and energy to no-deal planning had an impact on the United Kingdom's procedures and systems for general civil emergency preparedness. Is that right?
Yes, that is right.
Yes.
Is that a political point that you seek to make, or is it simply a statement of fact that in preparing for one thing, which was a necessary aim in itself, the preparation had to be done, there was inevitably going to be consequences on other areas from which government resources, time and effort were then going to be diverted?
No, let me be clear, it is not a political point, it is an administrative point. Yes, of course, there was an absolute need to prepare for exit from the European Union. The point that we seek to make is that there, as well as preparing for, if it came to it, a no-deal exit, there should have been capacity made available to continue to pursue preparedness planning in other fields.
Is the position of the United Kingdom government that, in fact, important work was done in the course of preparing for the no-deal exit, for example, in relation to the reinforcement of preparatory relationships and links between various entities, in relation to solidifying and better preparing supply chains, in relation to the training of civil servants, because of course they would have to be trained for the purposes of ensuring for all the worst aspects that could come from an unintended no-deal exit in terms of our preparedness structures. And therefore there were undoubtedly benefits which accrued as a result of the attention to that particular course.
Yes, I recognise those benefits in exactly the two ways you describe, which appear in the witness statements which we read, on supply chains and on the ability, the improvement in the capability to manage major emergencies, crises.
But at page 11, do you nevertheless identify that important work in the field of civil emergency, including work on healthcare provision, adult social care, resilience in critical sectors, planning for the use of the police and the military, the design of the central response structures, refreshing the 2011 pandemic preparedness strategy, and refreshing the UK pandemic influenza communication strategy, was affected to some degree or another?
Yes.
Agreed.
That deals with, in a very general sense, the United Kingdom government. Were there consequences also in relation to specifically Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland?
Yes, I think the witness statements bring the consequences in each administration, bring those out very clearly.
Page 12, please. So in relation to Wales...
So in relation to Wales, in the same way as, in my view, important aspects of public-facing preparedness, as opposed to Whitehall-facing preparedness, important aspects of public-facing preparedness had to be paused. There were benefits in Northern Ireland, and the witness statements make that very clear. Those are, again, focused on, although it is important, they are focused on the inward-facing within the administration capabilities.
In relation to Scotland, which I think is over the page, was there an impact insofar as the biennial every 2 years, the biennial report to Scottish ministers providing an overview of the resilience of essential services and critical infrastructure were not published?
Yes, this is the third aspect of in this analysis we broke the impact down into 3 areas. The first is preparedness within administration. The second is the assurance which ministers and senior officials could take on preparedness, and this paragraph covers exactly that. And then the public-facing activity preparing for the inevitable consequences of a severe pandemic.
If I may add, in the witness statements, there is a clear thread of a common feeling that there were areas in which responsibilities were not adequately clarified between central government and between the devolved administration.
And Professor Alexander, when you say in the witness statements, are you in fact referring to witness statements which have been obtained by the inquiry from United Kingdom government civil servants and employees?
I'm specifically referring to exactly those, but from members of the devolved administrations, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland.
Just before we go on, Mr. Mann, could you just expand a little on what you meant by Whitehall facing and public facing?
By Whitehall facing, I mean the preparedness within a government department or series of government departments. So more trained staff, better facilities and so on. It is all excellent, but it doesn't address the fact that preparedness for plans and preparedness for issues that would affect the public who would be affected by a major emergency were paused.
Thank you.
In relation to Northern Ireland, you say at the top of that page, if we still have it, page 13, by contrast, for the Northern Ireland Executive, EU exit planning was broadly beneficial in building generic resilience and preparedness. Although some matters were paused for other reasons, the assessment of the official most closely involved was that EU exit planning meant that Northern Ireland was in a better position to manage the demands of major emergencies. And is that in fact a reference to evidence obtained by the inquiry from the Permanent Secretary to the Executive Office in Northern Ireland, who provides a corporate statement which sets out the Executive Office's view of the impact of the diversion of resources and attention to EU exit, but concluded that broadly that planning was beneficial as far as Northern Ireland was concerned.
In exactly the same space. This is within the Executive.
You refer on the following page to the overall judgment of a gentleman called Sir David Stirling, who I think was the head of the Northern Irish Civil Service between 2017 and 2020. He says at paragraph 16 of your report, because you've cited a segment of his evidence, 3 challenges of persistent political instability, resource pressures and Brexit were significant issues in their own right. Together they combined to create a complex and difficult context and significant resource pressures. So in relation to Northern Ireland, having reviewed the material from the Northern Irish Executive Office, as well as other civil servants in Northern Ireland, have you noted that whilst the attention paid to a no-deal exit had some beneficial impacts, the position in Northern Ireland was a different one because of the issue concerning the collapse in the power-sharing agreement and what Sir David calls political instability?
Yes, we tried to describe on the basis, I suspect, of relatively limited evidence, the 3 issues which face Northern Ireland. We tried to bring out one key judgment which is that in March 2020, on the basis of the administrative issues inside Northern Ireland, a number of new and experienced staff had to be brought in at the very beginning of the response to the pandemic.
All right, thank you very much. That is the first point that I wanted to draw your attention to in a wide and generic way. The second point that you make in your report, in a general sense, is the need to look to the future. When asked to prepare recommendations and improvements in the way that you have, is it necessary to try to form a view or to try to look as far into the future as you can, so that whatever you recommend, if my lady adopts those recommendations and builds on them for herself, that those recommendations will stand the test of time and will have as long a term an impact as possible?
Yes.
Just in a very general sense, perhaps, Professor Alexander, where do we stand in the general scheme of things in terms of the United Kingdom's preparedness structures? When were they last subject to radical review?
I suppose, really, that the last very significant change was the construction and the passing of the Civil Contingencies Act in 2004, which removed the need to depend upon thoroughly outdated legislation from the Cold War and the civil defence period. That at least established statutory duties not merely among government, but among the providers of essential services. In my view, it didn't go far enough, but I think that is also the view of the independent review of the Civil Contingencies Act. But we also have the fact that the Civil Contingencies Act, good or bad as it might be, was essentially thrown out of the window during COVID. In other words, it was essentially replaced by the Coronavirus Act, which, although it was drafted in 2017, was essentially passed very quickly with little debate once the pandemic had started.
All right, well, we'll return to the question of the pandemic draft bill and the Coronavirus Act in due course. When, as you say, the Civil Contingencies Act was passed in 2004, had the passage of that bill and its coming into force come after a time when the government had been dealing with matters such as widespread flooding, I think foot and mouth, that there had been fuel protests in the years, or at least at some point in the 2 or 3 years before the Act. Was that primary legislative structure and the duties which were associated with it and the guidance and so on, to what extent were they informed by the political events that had taken place in the United Kingdom in the run-up to 2004?
I think they very much were. And if you look at the world scale, you tend to find that about 3/4 of legislation on disasters and how to cope with them follows the event. Now, that may well be because disaster events are very common. Worldwide, we have about 700 a year. But nevertheless, it is extremely common for a major event, a major civil contingency, to be the stimulus for a reappraisal leading to the passage of legislation to improve safety.
Has there been a significant change, Mr. Mann, in the what you would describe as the risk drivers which currently bear on the United Kingdom in terms of the risks that the country faces, its future? Has the need to have a proper and effective system in place changed on account of changes in those risk drivers?
Yes, I think there are 2 points here. First, the Act and the legislation, so the Act and its supporting arrangements, were taken through actually before the availability of the first national risk assessment. And there was a realisation and this was in my time in post, there was a realisation with the National Risk Assessment, a progressive realisation that some of those risks were national or indeed international in scale, and the arrangements that we had in place started with, indeed the Act has on the face of the Act, local arrangements. That's the first point. The second point, as we have developed as a society technologically, not only within the UK, but also internationally over the course of the last 20 years, those fundamental drivers, you have heard some evidence on this, in terms of urbanisation, population concentration, speed and frequency with which people travel, technological developments and so on, means that the position now is, in my view, fundamentally different to that in 2004.
So the risks that you've described appear to be more uncertain. They are of perhaps greater complexity, greater frequency. Is there also a greater risk now of what you describe as cascading events? That is to say, that the coming together of different risks simultaneously to create an even more complex emergency, or of an emergency developing in unexpected ways so that other areas are then open to crisis?
Yes, Professor Alexander has written the book on this, so I'll turn to him.
Professor, perhaps we'll hear from you on that one then.
I have a research group on cascading disasters, and we would argue that all major civil contingencies and many minor ones are cascading events by their very nature, because we live in networked societies which require us to interact in certain ways that can be easily disrupted by such impacts. So we're not only dealing with cascading events where you have, to begin with, the toppling dominoes metaphor, where one impact leads to another. We also have escalation points in that where the interaction of different kinds of vulnerability can cause a worse secondary impact to the one that started off the whole process on certain occasions. But apart from all of that, we have the possibility of concurrent events. Although this is not directly relevant to the UK, during COVID, there were 3 major earthquakes around the world. They required a very different way of dealing with the event to that required for dealing with an infectious disease. And yet it had to take place simultaneously. I think the UK in this was lucky, quite simply lucky, that it didn't have, for example, major flooding or something like that during COVID, because there could easily have been large natural hazard impact or something else that would have even further complicated the response required.
Thank you. The third general point that you make in your introduction is that future improvements and changes, significant changes to the structural system for emergency preparedness, response and resilience must reflect better than perhaps they have in the past societal and public expectation. What did you mean by that?
I meant that there is a range of societal factors, we list them in the report, which any preparedness structure, any law, any arrangements have got to take into account. They are built to protect people, they are built in the name of the people, and they've got to be embedded. It's not just about processes and law and structures and so on. This has got to have a human face to it. We've identified 5 in the report, of which, in our view, the most fundamental is competence. I'm happy to go through the others if you wish.
Well, we'll get to the conclusions in due course. You've separated out your conclusions by reference to some of these generic points.
May I add,
please,
that I think the UK is very good at foresight. In 2011 to 12, there was a major foresight programme regarding civil contingencies, and there is now another. And it is turning up some very interesting pictures of what the country is now facing and will probably be facing over the next 50 years. The question, however, remains the extent to which the results of such exercises are taken into account in the arrangements for dealing with events, and that is a very different matter.
So are you saying then, Professor, that whilst as a country and on the part of its various institutions, that there is good thinking going on in relation to the possibility of future risks, what they may consist of, and what challenges we as a country will face? The trick is to ensure that what arrangements are put into place to give effect to that foresight reflect public trust, reflect public confidence, ensure that we as a country have faith in those arrangements and therefore are more likely to comply with them and to follow them. Is that the issue?
Yes, indeed. I think the bottom line of all of this is, do you think that the British government, within the limits of its competency, keeps the public safe? I fear my answer to that is no, or not sufficiently.
Currently?
We have a very quick illustration of this. We have these foresight programs that have indicated what the hazards are, but we also have scenario building exercises in government, namely the National Risk Register and the National Security Risk Assessment, which have very short time horizons. And yet we know very well that many of the contingencies we face are going to change and grow in the short term, the medium, and the long term. And they will require adaptation to them.
And may we take it from what you've said, Professor, that that's your view of the current position, that currently the structures that we have in place do not keep us safe, or do not keep us as safe as you would wish and everybody would sensibly wish us to be. Is that your view?
That is indeed true. We are, of course, all responsible for our own safety, but government, of course, has an essential, fundamental and central role in providing safety to its population, and I think it could do more and better in that. All
right. Well, we'll return, of course, to some of the aspects to which you've made reference, particularly the National Security Risk Assessment in due course. The fourth general point that you raise and to which you refer is devolution. And this is an important point because, of course, this is a United Kingdom inquiry, and it is inquiring, of course, not just into arrangements in Westminster, the United Kingdom arrangements, but into the affairs of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. In a general sense, who or which structures bear the primary responsibility for dealing with resilience, dealing with preparedness, that is to say, being in a position to respond, and resilience, having the ability or capacity to be able to respond well?
I'm sorry if I appear to be avoiding the question. It has to be a shared responsibility, but technically and in law, civil contingencies is devolved in Scotland and Wales. There are particular arrangements affecting Northern Ireland.
So does it follow, Professor, please? Yes.
Yes, thank you. I agree entirely with what Mr. Mann says. However, I think if you look around the world, you would see that the management of civil contingencies only works if it is done at the local level, because that is invariably, no matter what the size of the event, the theatre of operations. Therefore, the quality of local organisation is absolutely paramount. It is, however, dependent on the quality of support given by higher levels of government. One of the problems we have in Britain is that if we leave aside the question of the devolved administrations, we don't have an intermediate tier to manage this. And at the same time, it is very hard to manage local endeavours from Westminster. Thank you.
Does it follow, therefore, from what you've both said, that proper and sensible recommendations must take into account the need to bring about improvements, not just in the national structures, but obviously the devolved structures and local structures, because all play their part in the overall system of preparedness and resilience.
Yes, it does. I fear that we are tacking back to your spaghetti diagram eventually. But yes, there are a wide range of organisations involved in preparedness and response. That means there's a wide range of interfaces between those organisations, and all of that has got to fit together smoothly.
The fifth point concerns the difference between resilience and preparedness.
Before you go on to that, Mr. Keith, I think I'm being
Ah,
encouraged.
yes. May I say, I think that's an excellent time to pause.
Forgive me, Professor Alexander, I hope you've got arrangements where you can get some lunch, Mr. Mann. Thank you both very much. See you at 1:45, please.
All right.